All right. Good afternoon. Welcome to a joint hearing on February 28th of the Senate Education and the House Education Committees. We're fortunate enough today to kind of get a look on the ground with an update from some superintendents and other school officials about the PCB testing program and how it's working. We are running this from the House Education Committee. However, our colleagues in the Senate will be participating, questions and whatnot. We have a long lineup, so I think we'll just get right into it. Mark Tucker from the Caledonia Central Supervisory Union is, I think, kicking things off. He's not on Zoom. He's here in our committee. Welcome you to the witness stand. Introduce yourself again. And
hi, I'm Mark Tucker. I'm the superintendent for Caledonia Central Supervisory Union. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to testify today. CCSU comprises 5 districts and 7 schools, including the Cabot School, one of the first 2 schools where airborne PCBs were detected during the legislature mandated testing. That happened as a result of testing conducted during July of 2022. Some of the people in this room are familiar with the difficulties that befell Cabot School as a result of being a PCB pioneer. Summer testing that was conducted with no HVAC systems running in the buildings, an initial report of test results that provided us with a test data dump but no immediate clarity on where the problems were, a need to close the school gymnasium because the initial airborne testing indicated it was unsafe for children in grades pre-K to 6. We closed the gym for everyone because it wasn't worthwhile trying to explain to a family that their 7th grader could be in the gym, but not their 6th grader. Its subsequent acknowledgement that the initial testing should not have occurred in a stagnant air environment, and the second round of airborne testing done in conjunction with source testing that delivered results that, had they resulted from the July testing, would not have forced us to close the gymnasium to student use in the first place. The cost of this repeat airborne testing was not covered by DEC, but was included in the overall cost for the source testing. Source testing in the gymnasium identified some likely sources of the airborne PCBs. One of those appears to be ceiling paint in the gymnasium that is original to the building's construction in 1971. That finding has caused our assigned engineer to recommend a second round of source testing meant to determine whether any of the ceiling paint has permeated the exposed trusses, the wood slat ceiling material, and perhaps even the roofing material above the ceiling. This last outcome would be discouraging as we just installed a new roof on the gym in 2017 at a cost of approximately $225,000. I don't mention any of this or anything I'm going to say from here on to be critical of our partners at DEC or the engineer they hired to do this work, or the Agency of Education for that matter. As frustrating as it has been at times to be on the receiving end of a process being done to us, a process that is guided by others, I've come to accept the fact that being a PCB pioneer means that I had to experience the effects of someone else's learning curve. It's not the process per se that has made this difficult. My frustrations stem from communication challenges that we might have predicted, given that chemists and engineers speak a very different language from the language we use when we talk to our families, had we had the time to plan for this together. DEC and our assigned engineer have been receptive to our feedback, and I know from my own observations with testing conducted at 3 of the 4 other schools in my SU that were flagged for PCB airborne testing, that they are trying hard to speak our language. I'd like to make 2 key points with you today about the proposed cost share approach to funding PCB remediation. First, there is no predictable endpoint for this process in any given school, which means we're trying to manage a process with no clear scope. Once the testing uncovers actionable levels of airborne PCBs in your school, you are entered into an iterative process that runs until your remediation efforts eliminate all of the PCB infested materials that are leaching into the air. So far, my experience, drawn from observing the pace of the work, tells me we'll be crossing fiscal years. We've already crossed district budgeting cycles twice, and we have been unable so far to conduct prudent financial planning around this issue. This is fundamentally why I think the state should be owning the solution by paying 100% of the cost, and therefore relieving school districts of the uncertainty of costs related to the remediation of PCBs in their buildings. Second, and most important, the proposed cost share method for reimbursing school districts for PCB mitigation and remediation, designed as it was to fit within a constrained funding pool, is by its nature inequitable. The recommendation that AOC and DEC submitted to the legislature calls for a cost share of 80% paid from the remediation fund and 20% paid by the affected district, with some caps on the total amounts available per district, and monies to be paid on a first come, first served basis until the remediation fund is exhausted. The 80-20 cost share follows the approach for distribution of the $2.5 million emergency fund approved by the emergency board last fall. It is worth noting here that the cost share imposed by the emergency board was a unilateral determination by the emergency board without the benefit of consideration by the full General Assembly. In my opinion, that should not be used as a standard by which the larger pool of funds should be allocated. The proposed reimbursement cost share does not acknowledge the fact that the presence of PCBs in building materials and the requirement to remove them is not constrained by the size or age of the school. There's simply no way to predict on a school-by-school basis how easy or complex the remediation effort will be. Additionally, the proposed reimbursement process is impact blind, by which I mean it doesn't take into account the capacity of any given district to raise the proportional 20% share of the mitigation and remediation costs. To the first point, it has been 8 months since we first learned the Cabot test results, and I still don't know what I have to do to fix the problem. For that matter, I still don't know how bad the problem is. We're now waiting for a second round of source testing in the gymnasium. The first round identified the primary culprit being the paint on the ceiling, which to my knowledge is original to when the gym was built in 1971. And the engineer gathered and tested ceiling paint flecks from the gym floor, and the paint has PCBs in it. That first round of source testing, which also included the art room in one of the satellite buildings, was estimated at $32,286 and came in a few dollars below the estimate. That work plan included retesting of the air in the gymnasium and our classroom under real-world conditions, namely with normal HVAC systems operating as they do whenever school is in session. As I mentioned at the beginning, the airborne levels in the gym were below the immediate action level, which allowed us to reopen the gymnasium just before the season turned against us. Here's where iteration reared its ugly head at Cabot. The discovery of PCBs in the ceiling paint opened a new line of technical inquiry. Is it possible that the paint has leached PCBs into the structural components of the roof? That question led to the creation of a second $17,000 source testing work plan for the gymnasium, which will examine exposed trusses, the wood slat ceiling itself, and also the 5-year-old insulation and roofing material installed above the ceiling in 2017. If we're lucky, the structural components are not infested, and we can look at a project to remove or seal the existing paint. If we're not lucky, we could be looking at a major renovation of the roof structure itself. How much any of this will cost is undetermined, but a ballpark guess would be $50,000 if we're just dealing with the ceiling paint, to several hundred thousands of dollars if we have to remove and replace structural components. Whatever the outcome of this second round of testing, it is my understanding that we are bound by regulatory guidelines that say we must remediate this summer. We need specific guidance to know what to do. Do we seal the existing paint, and if so, how? Or do we dismantle the ceiling entirely to replace trusses in the ceiling boards? We need to know what to do ASAP if there's any hope of getting this work done this summer. The costs the district is facing just for source testing were not anticipated when we established the FY23 budget in December of 2021. The FY24 budget does not include money for anticipated remediation cost shares because, aside from the fact we don't think there should be a cost share, we have no idea what the remediation cost will be and what our share will be if this 80-20 cost share proposal stands. So as a practical matter, we're looking at deficit spending in FY23 approaching $10,000 and deficit spending in FY24 in the tens of thousands if the worst case analysis proves true. I will say more about the difficulties this presents when I address my second point. To the second point, a fixed rate cost share model is by its very nature a violation of basic equity principles. PCB remediation costs, as I already noted, are blind to the financial capability of any particular school district And those costs, whatever they turn out to be, will fall more heavily on the smaller rural school districts that I serve in CCSU. The challenge is acute in Cabot. Cabot has a long history of difficulties passing school budgets. In my 7 years working with Cabot, 2 years as Special Services Director in Washington Northeast Supervisory Union, and 5+ years as Superintendent of Washington Northeast and CCSU, I've only seen 1 year where the school budget passed on the first vote. Last year, it took 2 votes to pass a budget. The other years, it has taken 3 votes each year. Much of this difficulty stemmed from resistance in the community to passing budgets that included an excess spending penalty, but the school has reconfigured its operations 3 times in the last 5 years to adjust staffing to levels that would result in an acceptable budget while maintaining programmatic integrity. Many will say that this is precisely why there used to be an excess spending penalty, but the net effect of this has been to cause many voters in the town to reflexively vote no at least once in hopes of forcing additional spending cuts, even in years where the homestead tax rate did not go up. My point is that there will be resistance in the Cabot community to any request for major capital spending to address PCB remediation. The expectation will instead be to find the money elsewhere, which means cutting staff and other programs that benefit students. That expectation will arise despite the fact that we are utilizing every staff member we have to address the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Ironically, as we present budgets to the voters next week, Cabot's frugality, achieved largely by program redesign and benefiting this year from a slight uptick in enrollment, results in Cabot having the lowest cost per equalized pupil among the 5 districts in CCSU. It hurts my heart to think that all of this hard work and restructuring may be undone by having to fund PCB remediation costs. Reflexively, Cabot voters remain laser focused on homestead tax rate from year to year, and they will want any additional costs related to PCB remediation to come without a proportional increase in their homestead tax rate. Forcing a small community like Cabot to shift instructional money away from kids towards PCB remediation is a clear violation of the basic tenets of equity in education that we all strive to achieve. Why should the socioeconomics of a community determine whether it can remediate PCBs and maintain a strong educational environment, both at the same time? I've already said that the scope of the PCB problem is dynamic and unpredictable. Once the school is found to have airborne PCBs at any level, it will be incumbent upon the school to remediate the PCBs at their source until the airborne levels approach 0. I've come to think of this process in terms of rinse and repeat. First, you find you have airborne PCBs, then you identify and remediate the likely sources, then you test again. If there are still airborne PCBs, you start all over with a source testing and remediation until you've cleaned it all up. Hopefully, if you find yourself in a test and remediate loop, each time the problem gets smaller and smaller. But I wouldn't swear that to be the case. The larger point is that the entire process is unpredictable until someone in DEC or U.S. Environmental Protection Agency says you're done. In one sense, we've been lucky so far in CCSU. We have test results for 4 of the 5 schools scheduled to be tested, and in no case have we faced the need to relocate instructional classrooms. I've spoken of Cabot's challenge. Source testing at Danville is underway literally today as I speak, with the problem largely isolated to a room containing electrical panels and communications equipment. If the recommendation in that case involves replacement of electrical panels that we already know are beyond their useful life, that is at least an outcome that will add value to and extend the life of part of the building. The testing at Waterford School found no actionable levels of PCBs anywhere in the building. Projects to remove and replace old siding, windows, and insulation over the past 5 years probably took care of any PCB materials that might have been in the original construction. And just last Friday, we received test results at Twinfield School that found airborne PCBs in 4 high school classrooms above the school action level, but below the immediate action level. So this will not impact instruction in the building. They did find airborne PCBs above the immediate action level in a maintenance in an HVAC attic in the building, but that attic is accessed rarely and only by maintenance staff. So again, no impact on instruction. But just as is the case with Cabot, Danville, Sorry, but just as is the case with Cabot, Danville and Twinfield are just entering their own cycle of the unknown, during which time we will be waiting for directions for remediating the PCBs that are the source of the airborne levels. And I expect the same challenges related to unpredictable costs and inability to budget for a share of those costs will apply in Danville and Twinfield too. Everything that I've said here about the unpredictability of local costs for PCB remediation applies to the overall state effort, but at exponential levels. I can't track the progress of this statewide effort, but I hear that first, the testing is way behind schedule, and two, about a quarter of those schools that have been tested have some PCB remediation ahead of them. I hope I'm wrong, but I bet that the $32 million remediation pool will be insufficient to meet the total cost once all of the state schools are tested. According to Secretary French, the $32 million fund balance drove the thinking of DEC and AOE when they made their recommendations for allocating the money. They sought a Solomon-like solution in the face of a constrained piece of data. I understand that money came from the Ed Fund surplus. So in a sense, the property taxpayers in Vermont have already contributed a share of that $32 million. The difficulty that I face out here in the field lies in convincing my local taxpayers, most of whom have a limited understanding of how education funding works, that they should be asked to raise additional money to resolve a problem they didn't know they had, and that so far as we know has not harmed anybody. We will address these problems in my schools. We have no choice. I just want to do it in a way that doesn't do harm to our primary mission, teaching and learning. Every decision we make with the thoughtful guidance of our school boards is made with one aim in mind. How do we maximize our resources for the betterment of the children in our care? As you all work towards a resolution of this financing conundrum, I will leave you with this one last thought. Our students didn't put PCBs in the school buildings, and they didn't tell us to take them out. Yet if some communities are forced to solve this problem by taking away funding from our educational mission, it will be our kids who are paying the price. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I think what we'll do is we'll continue with testimony and then save questions for the end. Does that sound okay with you over there on the set?
Sounds fine.
Great. Sherry Sosa, you are next.
Good afternoon, and thank you both committees for having us present to you on a very different perspective than Mark Tucker's. I am Sherry Souza. I'm the Windsor Central Supervisory Union Superintendent. We have 7 towns and over 1,100 students in our district. With me presenting is Raphael Adamek, who is our Director of Instructional Technology and Innovation, who also has a master's degree in public health and has been incredibly helpful in understanding our path as we address the implications of PCB testing and healthy learning environments in our district. I referred to our slideshow that we shared earlier. If everyone has that available to them, we're going to walk through that presentation. First of all, I think that it's really important to note that while Mark has been in the position to walk through, and he truly is a pioneer in the process that we're all looking for, there are those of us who are preparing for the testing and what it would mean for our buildings. In our second slide, I'm sorry. In our second slide, we'll be talking about what are PCBs, so we have a shared understanding what we've learned as school administrators around the PCBs and an impact in our student learning, the guidance we've received regarding airborne levels of PCBs. We have taken our own journey to understand the implications, not just in Vermont, but other states, and learn from the lessons of districts near us in New England. We'd like to talk about how WCSU is preparing for our testing, which will be in the next year, and then talking about school buildings in crisis in general. To our third slide, and I share this, Raphael will take over at this point.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us here to talk this through. So just a very brief background in PCBs. So PCBs were manufactured from 1929 to 1979. And as we've heard, they were included in many different building applications. For us, the most important appear to be fluorescent light ballasts, caulking, transformers and capacitors, thermal insulation material, adhesives and tapes, oil-based paint, but there are many, many more. School buildings built between 1950 and 1979 likely contain PCBs, and they have been identified as probable human carcinogens with non-cancerous impacts on the immune system, reproductive system, nervous system, and the endocrine system. On to the next slide. For our community, it was really important to have some context around the history of PCBs in Vermont. So with Burlington discovering PCBs in 2020, having to close their school and relocate to the former Macy's, sort of initiating this process. In June of 2021, Vermont passing Act 74, requiring all schools built or renovated before 1980 to be testing their indoor air for PCBs. And in November of 2021, the Vermont Department of Health released a memo establishing school action levels. And then in December of 2022, the establishment of the immediate action levels. So looking at these levels in a little bit more detail on the next slide, this has been part of the conversation that we've had with our community because there's been confusion about this. So the screening values were established by the Vermont Department of Health, set a level of 15 nanograms per meter cubed. And this was the level that Burlington used to make the decision to close the high school. The school action level was established by the Vermont Department of Health, established different levels for different age groups. And the lowest in this case was 30 nanograms per meter cubed for pre-K students. The immediate action level set a level that was 3 times the school action level for each age band, and set that a room should be closed until remediation is complete. So in this case, it was 90 nanograms per meter cubed for pre-K. Lastly, the EPA has some levels for evaluating PCBs in indoor air, and the lowest level that is set by them is 200 nanograms per meter cubed for pre-K and K students. These different levels have created some confusion in our communities and make communication a challenge as we work to explain to our communities what we're doing when we're going through this testing, what levels we will be using. The next slide, just to provide a little bit more context and a couple different contextual notes about these different levels. So one of the questions that has emerged is why are the EPA levels so different from the levels established by the Vermont Department of Health? From what we can gather, the Vermont Department of Health used the reasonable maximum exposure in their calculations, which sets the what's intended to be a reasonable but high level of exposure. So in this case, it was 9.75 hours per day for 235 days a year for 30 years. On the other hand, the EPA used central tendency or an estimate of average exposure. And so that appears to be part of the difference between why those different levels exist. And it may be that some schools cross one threshold and not the other. In terms of the health risk, the school action level may present an increased lifetime cancer risk of approximately 6 extra cases per million people exposed, or 1 per 166,000. So this has been important for our communities to understand the risk as we engage in this testing. PCBs are a very serious health concern. We know that PCB levels in schools have exceeded levels that are measured in outdoor air immediately adjacent to Superfund sites. But we're trying to determine what the appropriate level of risk to assume in our buildings is. And if there's one thing that we've learned, COVID has taught us that closing schools is incredibly detrimental to students, their families, and the communities. So next slide. So what are we doing now? So we're improving ventilation in our schools with 2 new air handling units. Some of the strategies that were used to minimize our COVID risks were also helpful in minimizing exposure to PCBs. So we've been able to use ESSER funding in this regard to help us. We've been seeking to identify possible sources of PCBs. Our fluorescent light ballasts were removed as part of an energy efficiency project, and some of our windows in our pre-K classrooms have been replaced in the last 2 years. We may end up sealing some potential PCB containing caulk if we can identify it. And we're examining PCB remediation plans from other school districts, such as Worcester, Mass, looking at their cleaning and maintenance protocols, and just trying to be as proactive as possible with the resources that we have.
Thank you, Raf. Next slide. But it's not just about PCBs. The health of our Vermont schools is the issue. What we've learned in our WCSU schools is that we have one school that has a failing sewer system. We've lost heat in multiple buildings this school year, and another school has a failing heating system. All the schools that were built prior to 1980 have questionable air quality. Air exchange systems are antiquated, air ducts have not been maintained, and the building materials used are shown to have significant impact on student and staff health, including PCDs and radon. Any one of these issues jeopardizes the physical health of our students and can result in a school closing. What I talk about, and you may find humor in the slide, but there's a lot of reality here, and it's a quote that it's often taken from me. In one of our buildings, we actually are one toilet flush away from closing a school of 450 students. But how did we get here? For us, and this is a picture that was taken about 2 weeks ago in the sewage system of our middle school and high school. It really is a lack of state funding. In 2007, Vermont put a moratorium on state aid for school building construction. In 2017, the WCSU board identified the need for a new middle school and high school building. And now in 2023, the building still has a questionable septic system, water system, and heating systems, even though we continue to send money to the Ed Fund. Any one of these things could close our school and interrupt the education of those 450 students. Currently, our district is having to fundraise to build a public school. The pandemic highlighted for us the issues in our schools. We know air quality is important. We know that when we have to move or interrupt student learning, and we were really lucky in WCSU. Our students were able to attend classes for the majority of the time. We had very few interruptions. However, we see the academic and the social emotional impact from those small interruptions. Our district does not have a facility close by that, in effect, if we weren't able to fix the septic system that you see photographed here, we would not be able to continue in that building or find another place. We have used our ESSER funding to begin the work of remediating individual buildings, but did not address all the needs. This reflects a broken system of school funding and dire need for new school construction. In the next slide, this is the funding that was submitted to legislation in terms of how to address the PCB funding. And as you can see, and as Superintendent Tucker noted, the request for an 80-20 split. I think that Mark did a really nice job in highlighting how we decide and how do we create budgets in terms of education. We begin the year previously in the fall to begin to identify what our needs are. We currently are putting as many dollars as we can to our facilities, and in fact have already begun to cut positions so we can meet the facility needs of our buildings. But the request for 20% cost share in terms of this DEC approved activities is really concerning because we are barely keeping our facilities open now. We are already impacting student learning by cutting programming. This is another additional request when we have no idea what the impact is going to be in terms of, as Superintendent Tucker noted, what will be the potential and what could be the impact. The current AOE, next slide, the current AOE recommendation for costs associated with PCBs, remediation plans are created by a contracted engineer. The school district has no input other than providing availability to our buildings. Those plans then need to be approved by the DEC. We have, again, no control over the cost or decision-making. Districts must comply with the plan requirements and bear the burden for 20% of associated costs. As Superintendent Tucker noted, this really is out of our control, but our financial responsibility.
The Estabrook School in Lexington, Mass. May be an important case study for us to consider. Back in 2010, they tested for PCBs, found them, and engaged in a remediation process and study, spent approximately $1 million. 2 years after starting that process, the remediation was deemed to have failed and they broke ground on a new school. And so there's a real risk of putting good money into bad buildings that cannot be remediated.
And I think that's important to note in our situation. If we had funding in 2017, we would have a brand new middle school and high school at this point in time. But because we only are left to the taxpayer dollars and raising money, we are 6 years into it and are just beginning to get finalization of plans. And we have to consider PCBs and our other systems issues. Our message today is students deserve healthy learning environments. Our students cannot afford another interruption to their learning, and schools cannot close again. We've learned that, and we've learned it deeply. School facility funding must be addressed immediately. And finally, any questions you have, we're available to answer. Myself and Raphael have been spending a great deal of time and communicating to our communities about these issues, but you can see for us, this has been really a serious consideration. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. Appreciate the effort you put into not only putting together a great presentation, but looking into other case studies such as the one in Massachusetts. We'll move ahead and hear from Renee Sanchez from the Champlain Valley School District.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Renee Sanchez, as I serve as the Champlain Valley School District Superintendent. I would like to thank the House and Senate Education Committees for allowing me to provide testimony on behalf of VSA and the VSBA. I'm here to advocate for the VSBA and VSA recommendation of allocating funds to cover the full costs of any mandated educational programs or requirements, as well as covering the costs of PCB and radon remediation, irrespective of when it was discovered and whether a community has already successfully completed a bond to cover its cost. As a CVSD superintendent, I believe that there are two main concerns with the legislation that requires Vermont districts to share remediation and construction costs at the 80-20 ratio. The first issue is the unknown potential cost of each building, and the second is, at least for CVSD, Act 127. So far, CVSD has been fortunate to have only 2 spaces in one of our buildings, Charlotte Central, where we found PCBs that exceeded adult levels. At CCS, we should be able to remediate the PCB levels without classroom disruption in both spaces. For the rest of our schools, we have yet to test. So at this point, as Superintendent Tucker stated, we do not know the total costs should any of our other district schools require remediation. So it is incredibly difficult to account for it during our regular budget processes. If the PCB cleanup costs should exceed $10 million at any one of our schools, our district would have to cover 20% and any costs above it. Or should one of our schools need to close to remediate a wing or the entirety of the campus, we currently would not have a place to offer classes. If we were able to rent a location, it is not clear that the rent and modifications of the space to make it into a school location would be covered. As an example, in the summer of 2021, in the Heinsberg Community School, we self-identified 42 windows that exceeded 5 times the allowable PCB levels. We remediated and replaced the windows at a total cost of nearly $600,000. Had we learned of this PCB level during the school year, we would have been forced to find other locations off-site for the affected classrooms to hold their daily lessons. My second concern from above is that CVSD enters the 5-year implementation period for Act 127. During this timeframe, we must plan on reducing budgets rather than plan for unknown amounts needed to address PCBs. Here are some highlights of the costs that we will have to keep in mind. First, there are only a few companies in the state that can accommodate remediation in schools. This will have an impact on schedules and will cause schools delays or having to find swing space, that is alternative locations where we can continue our educational processes. And swing space is very limited in our community as well as many communities around Vermont. Next, if schools are required to remove building materials other than tile and mastic, that is sheetrock, brick walls, or any impervious material, the cost is going to escalate significantly. This will have a direct impact on the construction schedules and the cost of materials. There are long delays in building materials, which will have a significant impact as well. The current cost to remodel a school is between $400 and $500 per square foot. Similar to what Superintendent Sousa and Director Adamick suggested, the cost to build new is only, compared to the previous amount, $550 to $600 per square foot. The cost escalation each year will be anywhere between 5% to 15%, depending on materials and labor. Finally, if an unexpectedly large 20% contribution is needed, plus any cost for moving students, even one that does not exceed the maximum distribution, that could lead to our district and other districts overspending our budget, committing our entire fund balance, or raising the following year's budget above the 10% level, thus causing an automatic Secretary of Education review of the district's budget. In closing, I believe that the legislation for the remediation and cost sharing of PCBs and radon emanates from the right place to ensure student and staff safety. However, with the many additional requirements of the educational quality standards, COVID recovery post-ESSER, and the updating and modernization of our school buildings already on the horizon, I humbly request allocating funds to cover the full cost of any mandated educational programs or requirements, as well as covering the full costs of PCB and radon remediation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We're going to move right ahead because I'd like want to make sure we have enough time for questions. So Frank Rucker from Wyndham Southeast.
Hello, thank you for giving us the opportunity to share our experience. So as you said, we're from Wyndham Southeast Supervisory Union. We're about 2,500 students with 5 towns, Brattleboro being the largest town. So I just wanted to emphasize some of the many very vital points that have been made here by our other presenters. I would say, first, as we try to comply with the intent of the law, the point around difficulty in clarifying the scope of work is challenging and obviously a big obstacle to us being able to move forward with a bid process to, in our case, at our Oak Grove school, that we have identified PCBs present, to remove and replace the windows. I also would want to emphasize the issue that we're a high poverty area. Most of our schools are eligible for the Title I funding. And as the point was made earlier, it's obviously more severe for us to fund these unanticipated costs than, let's say, maybe South Burlington or many other communities. And another, I think, important point for us is we do have a long-term capital plan. We've done, I think, a very responsible job in maintaining our HVAC systems, our various health and safety components of our buildings. We have a 20-year bond maturing this year for the Brattleboro Union High School. Some of you may recall that was at one time the largest bond in the state of Vermont for a high school renovation. So we know these assets are coming due to be replaced. We've done the best we can to prepare for that. But this compromise with the PCB mandate, given the magnitude of the cost that you've heard from all the presenters today, and then the unpredictability of it, it will seriously compromise our ability to maintain a safe and healthy facility. For example, it was about a $60 million bond in 2003. We know the roof has reached its useful life. We have planned for a replacement next year. It'll be over $1 million and it will be in phases. But if we have to move that aside to address this unanticipated cost, obviously that's a major compromise to our health and safety of our schools. So I just wanted to emphasize that we have 10 schools. We only have one tested, and we have identified the PCB along with some remediation work. But if we have any sort of a similar outcome for our 9 other schools, we won't be able to, provide a responsible plan moving forward with our public, given the magnitude of the unpredictability and the magnitude of the costs. So those are just some comments. Unfortunately, our experience is mirrored very much what Superintendent Tucker has shared with you in terms of difficulty in the communication between the scientists, the engineers, the chemists, and our moms and dads, and the ability to explain why we are moving kids around and potentially interrupting, bus schedules and so on. So it's clear that there needs to be more support and coordination at the state level in order for us to be able to do our job here in the public schools. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll jump right over to Neil Odell from the VSBA. Neil, welcome back to our committees.
Thank you very much, Chair Conlon, and thanks for the opportunity to testify on the 2023 PCBs and Schools Funding Report. Once again, my name is Neil Odell, and I am president of the Vermont School Boards Association. I also serve on the Norwich, Dresden, and SAU 70 school district boards. My testimony today is guided by 2 resolutions passed by VSBA's membership. The first is titled Unfunded Mandates, and the language of that resolution was all new educational requirements or programs mandated by the federal government or the state of Vermont should be fully funded by either the federal or state government. The second resolution was titled Capital Spending, and the language of that resolution was the VSBA advocates that the Vermont legislature allocate funds to assist school districts with PCB and radon remediation, including districts whose contamination was discovered prior to the legislation and irrespective of costs covered by capital bonding. So with those 2 resolutions as the basis for the testimony, the PCBs and Schools Funding Report includes a proposed cost share method of 80% paid from the remediation fund and 20% paid by the affected district, with some caps on the total amounts available per district, and monies to be paid on a first come, first served basis until the remediation fund is exhausted. The 80-20 cost share follows the approach for distribution of the $2.5 million emergency fund approved by the emergency board last fall, which was a unilateral decision determined by the board without the benefit of consideration by the full General Assembly. It should not be used as the standard by which the larger pool of funds will be allocated. The proposed cost share does not take into account the reality that the presence of PCBs and building materials and the requirement to remove them is unrelated to the size or the age of the school. There's no way to predict how easy or complex the remediation effort will be in any particular school. Additionally, the proposed reimbursement process doesn't take into account the capacity of any given school district to raise the proportional 20% share of the mitigation and remediation costs. These factors, along with the legislature's adoption of an unfunded mandate, make it impossible in most cases for a school board to budget for the 20% share of mitigation and remediation costs. As purposeful as the requirements may be, and as important as addressing PCB contamination in schools is, the fact remains that this is an initiative brought about entirely without involvement on the part of school districts in creating the problem, and without any planned for capacity on the part of school districts to contend with it. For these reasons, VSBA opposes the 80-20 cost share proposal and appeals to the General Assembly to fully fund whatever work is deemed necessary to address this problem in accordance with the guidelines and requirements set forth by the state. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Mark Tucker, why don't you come back and join us up here? I'm going to throw it over to our colleagues in the Senate to lead off any questioning.
Yeah. Great, thanks. We have a 4 o'clock stop for a couple of us, so I was going to see if we had any questions that, while we have folks here in the room. Do you want to start, Senator Wood?
Sure. So I've heard the term PCBs. Where did they originate? I mean, is it an oversimplification that somebody may be responsible for putting PCBs in caulking compound and paint? And if so, where's the Attorney General in this?
I'm not sure any of our guests are qualified to answer that. I don't know if anybody wants to take a stab. Go ahead.
Well, it's just based on, because I listened to testimony in Senate Education, I think it was last week, from the DEC folks. And I thought they made it clear that Monsanto was the only manufacturer of PCBs. While Monsanto, I don't think created all the building materials, I have to believe that they had a lot to do with getting building material manufacturers to put that chemical or those chemicals, whatever, into their building materials. But as far as I know, Monsanto is the only source of that. I can't speak to what the Attorney General thinks about anything. That's way above my pay grade.
It's a good question, and I know the Attorney General's in the process, I think, looking at this issue. I don't want to speak for her, but I believe Senator Hewitt.
Senator Hashim will go, so I'm going to be longer, I think.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So it is more of a comment that is related to all of this. One of the things that we were talking about last week regarding school construction is trying to make sure we're not keeping PCB testing and remediation in its own bubble, separate from our school construction bill. And I think that something that I think it was Mr. Adamic mentioned, the Estabrook school case. And one of my concerns is we start the remediation process in any school and then realize that it's just too far gone, and then we've already spent tons of money on that remediation process on top of having to build a new school. So when it comes to school construction and new construction, I hope that we continue looking at PCB testing in that nexus. So more of a comment, less of a question.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for your amazing testimony. It's just incredible to hear all the various stories. And I was really interested to hear about Lexington, Mass. That was, I didn't know about that. That's very interesting. So I'm going to say what I said a few weeks ago in this committee when I spoke to the AOE and ANR, which is that I have to identify the elephant in the room, which is BHS. And Mr. Tucker, I really appreciate your point that you were a guinea pig in the PCB plan or program. But I would just say that there was a guinea pig before the guinea pig, which was BHS. I mean, the program would not exist if it weren't for BHS. So I do think, we have to acknowledge it as something that's out there. And as much as I'm very close to it, I'm trying to be objective when I look at the situation. In terms of the 80.
Can I stop for a second? Just to clarify, BHS being Burlington High School for our listening audience.
Yeah. In terms of the 80-20 model, I completely agree. I think that it's just, it's asking a lot of our school districts to be trying to foot the bill for costs that were not budgeted for, that were not foreseen. Many of us didn't know what PCBs were a few years ago. And then to Senator Hashim's point, I know I'm jumping all over the place, but I've been someone who's been saying, let's not conflate school construction with PCBs. But I do think there will come a time as we move forward, as you know, we're all working on a bill around school construction, where there's going to be a nexus between the two. And there's going to have to be at that point, I think there's going to have to be sort of a relook and a reimagining of how we distribute funds around construction and PCBs. For now, my sense is we've allocated this money. we need to allocate more money. We need to ask for, as far as I'm concerned, more of an appropriation, and we need to prioritize this. Because I don't need to tell you all that when you don't have a school building, the results are devastating, and they have trickle-down effects over years and years. For us, you know, we came off a 4-month COVID, you know, lockdown, so no one was in school the spring of 2020. Summer came in, and then fall hit, and we were out for another 5 months. That is a long time for students to be out of school. And not only, as I've said to folks in this committee, did we lose students who either moved out of the city, went and worked, or simply dropped out of school, we also lost families who sent their kids to private schools because they didn't want their kids to be housed in a Macy's department store. And that ultimately affects our bottom line as a school district. So there are ripple effects that continue on down the line. Obviously, our scores, you know, you look at literacy. We've been working so hard at trying to lower the achievement gap and the opportunity gap, but this threw all of that out the window. So we have to set this as a priority. I think we've got the money set aside now. We need to use it. When you have a leaky roof, you don't wait for more leaks. You fix the leak. So we got to fix the problems now, and spend that money. I'm sorry. I mean, I don't mean to sound flip, but it's really important that we address the critical needs now, and help those districts that need it the most. To Mr. Rucker and Mr. Tucker's points, equity has to be part of this equation. The small towns that can't bond need to somehow rise to, you know, an emergency level. I want to again highlight Burlington, because a lot of folks will say, well, you've got the money, you bonded. Well, remember that we were placed in a building with a 3.5-year lease. So we're out of our current location in a couple of years. We had to pass a bond. We had no choice. So it's not like this was an option for us, for Burlington. I guess those are my comments. I really appreciate what everyone said here. I want to keep jumping back to Lexington too, as a really important example of, if we start putting money into schools that need the PCBs, you know, and then they need to be totally rebuilt down the line, what does that look like? So I think we need to act fast, and we need to be organized in the way we do this. And I'd like to hear, you know, more specifically what you would like from the legislature, if that's possible.
I think you all just heard wondering suggestions you might have, I suppose, other than the 80-20 going to 100%.
I thank Superintendent Sousa. I think you laid it out pretty clearly for us in terms of what, you know, what the ask and the needs are here, that are much bigger and more holistic than perhaps just PCBs. I appreciate your presentation. Thanks.
Thank you for that. And I think that's the message we wanted to convey. We really appreciate what other districts are going through, but our anticipation really looks at the big picture. We learned through the pandemic how important healthy environments, air quality, air exchange systems, we fully utilize that. But we are in the point where we're trying to pass a 5-year loan to put a heating system in a building that we know we have to take down. And so our towns are going to have to approve, hopefully next week, over $1 million to put a heating system in a building that won't last. That is devastating to say to our communities. And I see the same happening with regards to PCBs. There are many health issues that our students and our faculty and staff are addressing every day, and that the result of facilities that have well worn out their time. But thank you, I appreciate that feedback.
I think one of the issues we have is that because the testing was started and is up and running and results are, you know, relatively quick, PCBs is an immediate problem. School construction is a longer term problem that, the legislation that's originating in the Senate talks about a task force to create a commission, and it's a few years down the road. So I guess I would float the idea, I'd like some reaction to it. Should we pause what's going on with PCBs until we get a broader look at school construction and how this PCB testing folds into that? Say, jump in, whoever would like to.
Can I ask a question that's sort of involved?
Sure. Yes, Representative Bus will clarify my thoughts.
Well, my question is, if we use the EPA levels and not the Vermont levels, how many people, how many schools would be clear?
We haven't done enough testing to know the answer to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Senator Gulick had her hand up. I didn't know if you wanted to respond, Senator Gulick, to the point about pausing PCB testing, or.
I'm just concerned that, there may be, I'm worried about poisoning our students and our staff and faculty while we wait on school construction. That's my only comment. Our tech center had levels that were in the thousands. So if we had kept that open with kids and adults in that building, I mean, that's just, I don't know, that doesn't seem responsible.
Yeah, and I would echo what Senator Gulick is saying. This is a public health issue. It's a right to know issue. I know this committee over the past couple of years had this conversation with others, and I certainly agree that pausing isn't a good idea at this point.
Well, I would like you to consider Representative Buss's recommendation. I think when you look at the extreme polarity of those two levels, is there an intermediate? I think that what you've heard from the other superintendents speaking, that many are just over that level that has been set by the Vermont. I think what would be helpful is, and encouraging to communities, is that if our legislature begins to make a commitment around new facilities and new facility funding, that gives us a new orientation in terms of how do we respond to PCBs and all in terms of long-term planning. Right now, many districts who have moved forward to receive bonds for new facility or renovation have been voted down because towns only see that their taxpayer dollars are funding these renovations or new facilities. If they see a light, and I know that's true for our communities, that there may be at a point in time funding at the state level, that's a very different presentation to our communities about how do we move forward. And so I would appreciate consideration of looking at those levels. Is there an intermediate EPA at one extreme, Vermont levels at another? And then how do we move forward for long-term planning?
Just jump in.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree with Representative Buss and with Souza as well. I think you both bring up incredible points. When you look at PCB levels, you do look at hourly exposure and exposure over time. So I agree with you that if, when we were judged at 50 nanograms per cubic meter, I mean, that was just incredibly unrealistic. What other levels? I would love to see other levels that are used around the world. I've asked for those and no one sent them to me, unfortunately. But if we do have, let's say, a 5-year timeline, like in 5 years, this building is going to be totally rebuilt, then can we use PCB levels to speak to that 5-year timeline as opposed to 230 days a year for 30 years? I think that's a really, really important question to ask. Thank you.
If I could make a comment on that. So Frank Rucker, I'm the business administrator in the Brattleboro Wyndham Southeast Supervisory Union. The central issue around the magnitude of the problem and then our ability to respond to it, it would be so helpful if that was clarified. And what we're seeing, being some of those early testers like Mark Tucker and Cabot, is that the industry, the lab capacity is overwhelmed even at this very early stage. So our ability to get feedback make good decisions around the magnitude of risk. We're not scientists. We don't know the magnitude of risk between 500 ng or 100 ng or 30 ng. And if the legislature could not only create capacity by maybe instead of each of us school districts going out to a individual lab or a contractor to address the mitigation or remediation, the state or the legislature would help the DEC or whatever state agency to create capacity to do this regionally and do it efficiently, effectively. Because what we're seeing is we're competing against each other, school to school, and we're competing against the state in terms of access to contractors and labs. So I very much appreciate the concern about safety. I was a graduate of Cabot Elementary many years ago when they first built that gym, 1970s. But you know, that is most important to us, obviously, as educators. The safety of our children, the ability for us to be able to communicate with our families that we are being responsible. So this issue of the magnitude of risk, the ability to define it, the ability to get it through the labs, and then interpret the information would be a huge help at this point.
Mark, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, if I could, thinking out loud, which isn't always the best thing for me to do, but three points. One is that in the current guidelines, there was no distinction made in terms of the particular use of the space and the size of the space. So the fact that a gymnasium at a school, as you can imagine, the size of a typical gymnasium with 60-foot ceilings and all that stuff, and the kids are in there for maybe 45 minutes twice a week. We have the same remediation concerns for that space as we would if we had a 400 or 500 square foot classroom where we had to remediate, where we had kids in the classroom all day long. That's one point. The second point is I'm getting a little, more than a little concerned. This isn't a criticism of anybody that's talking here, but I'm sitting on an Efficiency Vermont indoor air quality improvement grant that was awarded to Cabot School late last fall, and which is intended to upgrade and update the existing air handling system on the entire campus. And Cabot is a campus-based school. It's not a contained building. But it's being suggested to me that maybe you don't want to spend that money right now until you figure out your PCB problem, which is, to me, is kind of ironic because improving indoor air quality is the number one best thing that you can do in any building. If you have a PCB problem, is make sure that the air is constantly changed, filtered, or whatever, and that's intended to be part of that project. The last point is, I think it's great that the state is doing a study of all the school facilities, but there's no synchronization between that schedule and this schedule. So, if somebody in a position of power or authority is going to say, well, we're going to hold off on the PCB work until we figure out what the overall school facility challenge is, that sounds good, but somebody's got to get US EPA off my back, because they're the ones, as I understand it, that told DEC that we could wait until the school year was over, but you had to fix it this summer. So I'm feeling a little pressure from one end that we've got to do something. And as I said in my testimony, I don't know what that something is yet. At the same time that, I would like to upgrade the HVAC system on that school campus in general. At the same time that, we just don't, we don't know what we're supposed to be doing. So there's a lot of pressure points and ideas coming from different directions. So I would love some clarity around it. I would like to know who's, if somebody lay out a timeline, we're going to do this first, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this. Great. Then we'll go and do it if you give us some money. I'm going to keep going back to that, but
Mark, since you're kind of in the thick of this and was really the first one, the role that the AOE said they wanted to play in all of this was to really help school districts communicate with parents about what this meant, and just sort of to either provide them the information they needed to know in the language that they could understand. And I guess, could you talk a little bit about how your work has intersected with the AOE's efforts to assist in that?
So we've been working with the AOE in terms of, I was invited to join an advisory group that the secretary put together, and I'm on that group, and I think Sherry, you're on that group, and a few of the other people here. And we talk about this problem, and the AOE has taken the position that they're not driving the process, but they want to help coordinate it. But I would say that the work that's been done and is continuing is going to benefit schools that haven't gone through this process yet. I'm not blowing my own horn here, but some of the things that the agency has put out, and it's a 10 or 12 page guideline for school districts that are facing PCB airborne testing, I think is going to be very helpful for those school districts. I got hit with this in August. I got a call from the health department the Friday before we were opening school the following Wednesday. I got a call from the health department on Friday and said, oh, by the way, we should probably get together because we found PCBs in your school and you might want to know about this before you open your school. So we were in a mad scramble, to deal with that problem and figure out what we were going to do. The communication with our community, I didn't use what DEC gave me because they gave me a 100-page report, and I wasn't going to give that to anybody to read. I read it, and it was tough work. One of the challenges with communication is that as good as the data collection and data reporting is, and that's a necessary scientific effort, number one thing that parents want to know is it safe for me to send my kids to school? So when they said, here's what you should be sending out to your families, I said, I'm not doing that. And I boiled it down to like a one-page newsletter and said, this is what we found. This is the impact. We're closing the gym. The rest of the building is safe. You can send your kids to school on Wednesday. That was the communication in the community. And I didn't get a single bit of pushback from anybody in the community. I think because I delivered a simple, straightforward message. It said it's safe to be in school. And that's the model that I followed with Danville. Waterford was an easy message. It came out just before Christmas. It's like, no problem in Waterford. And now Twinfield, very limited issue at Twinfield. And ironically, that report came to me the Friday before school vacation, but that's already gone on to the community. So, but if you haven't seen it, I would point you, I don't have it here, but I would point you to the guideline that the agency published, which had a lot of input from all of us on this advisory group, and I think it's going to help the other schools. I heard it right last week, they've only tested in 47 schools so far, so 47 out of 320, I don't do math in my head, but that's a very small sample size. So there's a lot of schools coming down the road. So I hope they're going to take advantage of that communication work.
And the reaction from parents, I would have worried that they would say, well, if PCBs are dangerous, I don't consider any level safe.
That's exactly what I thought was going to happen, and I haven't had that reaction from anybody. And I don't understand it. And I understand anecdotally that some other communities have had different experiences with that. I don't know the specifics. I think is Renee still on? I heard that there was some upset in Charlotte. But I don't know what to attribute that to. But I've gone through this 4 times now, and I haven't had nobody with pitchforks and torches outside my office. So.
Superintendent Sanchez, pitchforks and torches at your office?
No, not yet. So I am happy to say there is a level of concern of when the adult levels are met in certain parts of the building, where adults are mainly the people who work in those areas, and then their concern is how long long, what are the measurements? How long do I need to be here now? And these levels, when are they dangerous? That was a long kind of complicated explanation that we provided to the workers who received the notice that we provided individually. And so there is just kind of the ongoing concern about the remediation. We've just recently provided filters, to improve the circulation of the air in the locations around the building, so that kind of assuaged some fears. But the continuing forth, we want to be able to resolve and remediate as soon as we can. And that's really the only way that I think we can avoid the pitchforks.
Well, that's an interesting point, Renee, because I haven't had the experience where the threshold, where we were above the adult threshold. So I haven't had to deal with teaching staff and school staff who were concerned about their safety. And they're probably the ones that might be the most vocal about that concern. So our levels have been down. Not that nobody cares about the kids, I don't mean to say that, but it hasn't hit the adults in the same way that it's affected kids. And we haven't interrupted instruction. There was no uproar in Cabot when we closed the gym at the beginning of September, because it's still nice out. And they do outdoor PE anyway until there's snow on the ground. And that came late this year. So we lucked out with the weather, but it could have been more complicated.
So in Charlotte, we were lucky, well, I'm not going to say lucky, but that the PCB adult levels were found in the kitchen, but not in the cafeteria. And so we've been able to continue student feeding operations outside of the cafeteria and going into the kitchen in a very minimal fashion. So but we were lucky that it was not the other way around. Otherwise, we would have had to have eaten in classrooms and in other spaces in the building.
Committee, any other questions on this side? Senate Education, any further questions on your end?
Doesn't look like it.
All right. Well, thank you to all of our school officials for coming in and making the time and kind of giving us a much better boots on the ground look at this. Appreciate it.
Thanks for asking us.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.